Alright, Brobs, we're back with another chapter of So the Witch Won't Eat Me. Fantasy and the Child's Fear of Infanticide by Dorothy Bloch. I believe this is chapter 5. The fantasy of a dog that didn't deserve to be a child. As soon as the child feels sufficiently secure and assured of acceptance, the fantasy, which may be a remarkable condensation of his perception of his central conflict, may begin to evolve until its resolution frees him to verbalize directly the perceptions and the feelings it had camouflaged. Whether or not the fantasy can successfully reach that point may depend on both the parents' capacity for change and the analyst's skill in handling the fantasy. Where there is little or no alleviation of the threat coming from the environment, the child's need for a defensive fantasy may not be entirely resolved. The crucial issue in the handling of fantasy is, first of all, the meaning of the communication. As long as the method of child analysis was influenced by the concept that children's fantasies are divorced from reality, a prime source of investigation was cut off. Although Melanie Klein's play technique provided an invaluable tool for understanding fantasy, her elimination of the parents' role in treating children limited its usefulness. Anna Freud's readier acceptance of the objective world as an important factor in the child's mechanisms of defense prepared the way for our present understanding of the role of the parent-child relationship in the genesis of the child's emotional problems. That orientation and the recognition of the child's fear of infanticide provide the key to the meaning of his communication. As established in the case of Ellie and of the other children discussed, the first task in understanding the child's fantasy is to amass as much data as possible on the history and the development of the child's life. Other procedures in the handling of fantasy are dictated by its dual function. Defensive fantasies are designed not only to provide an outlet for the child's unbearable terror, but also by projecting it onto imaginary creatures to conceal its source, thus enabling him to preserve the idealized and potentially loving image of his parents that appears so fundamental to his feeling of security and scarcity. It therefore follows that any exposure of the real basis for the child's fantasy or any attempt to reach beyond its framework with the suggestion of its true meanings may threaten the defense to such a degree as to put an end to the fantasy and disqualify the analyst as a trustworthy confidant. Such exposure may even endanger the child's life. This principle was dramatically demonstrated when a young colleague asked a child whom he was treating if he could identify the figure in his fantasy, and the reply came, "If I knew who they were, I'd kill myself." A very impressive aspect of the child's use of fantasy is its revelation of his frequently unerring sense of his psychological requirements. In his struggle to stay alive, since identity is a primary instrument in his defense and an essential element in his system of self-deception, as we have seen in the cases presented so far, it may become the focal point of his fantasy. In working out his fantasy, his identity and mine and our relationship to each other may be continually modified along with the situation and the setting, which may also change to accommodate his changing needs. A fantasy may progress through several stages over a number of years until its resolution brings the child to a point where he is ready to express directly the thoughts and feelings his fantasy had concealed. What may happen to children's fantasies when the child does not receive psychoanalytic help was revealed in my work with adult patients. In those instances where they were able to disinter them, the early fantasies appeared simply to have gone underground, and as part of their unconscious, they continued to exert a controlling influence on their lives. I would have to say there's a lot of people who have been mistreated who turn out to be standard citizens and not, just private weirdos. Maybe I'm wrong, but I would say the likelihood of a perfect parenthood where there's no child trauma is about 20% at best. In the case of Patty, an only child who was referred at the age of 7 with the diagnosis of schizophrenia, the fantasy that she lightly introduced during her first session developed over a period of more than 3 years. Identity was her major concern. At the outset of her treatment, she was a non human, a lowly, sexless creature who gradually became feminine. After a preliminary phase in which she assumed roles that would elicit praise, she adopted the identity first of a horse and then of a dog that didn't deserve to be a child. Having been left to my own devices initially, I was also assigned an identity, first of a wicked and then of a good owner. Her ability to meet her emotional needs at each stage of her constantly evolving fantasy until she emerged from schizophrenia was a remarkable testament to the reliability of the psyche and the struggle to remain alive. All she seemed to require of me was acceptance and understanding and a willingness to assist her along whatever paths she followed. Although as the process was unfolding, sea. I was frequently at sea concerning her direction. Patty's steady progress verified its correctness. I had very little success with her parents, however. They remained unchanged in their feelings toward Patty, and therefore I surmised prevented the resolution to her fantasy. Although I have no first-hand knowledge of the violence to which Patty's parents had exposed or subjected her, both her symptoms and the nature of her fantasy suggested unusually cruel treatment. From their first interview, her parents made very clear that Patty had been an unplanned and untimely interruption in their lives that they had never ceased to resent. Her father was a lawyer whose career had scarcely gotten underway when she was born. Her mother had wanted to be a singer, but abandoned her ambition with Patty's arrival. I had the impression that neither parent had received adequate mothering or had known anything but a hostile, ungiving environment. Patty's father was small and unsmiling, his aggression locked in and, like most of his feelings, unavailable. I mean, he is a lawyer. He's got to keep himself under control. Her mother was slight, blonde, and blue-eyed, and moderately attractive. She appeared more open and less inhibited about expressing her destructive feelings, or, as I learned, in acting on them. They were both mortified by the impression Patty created in public. The incident that precipitated their bringing her to see me was a children's birthday party at which her bizarre behavior filled them with shame. She appeared unrelated to the others and off in a world of her own. Although she generally ignored other children, she was very ingratiating with adults and latched onto every visitor with a hunger they found embarrassing. Embarrassing. She was friendless and withdrawn and usually cried herself to sleep at night. Both parents were united in their description of her uncooperative, negative, provocative character. My first memory of Patty is indelible. I recall a curious sinking feeling as she first strutted stiffly past me, slapping her feet as she walked, robot fashion, unsmiling, and apparently unseeing, down the long hallway to the playroom. She was small for her 7 years and wore her red hair long in unkempt masses that dramatized the delicacy of her face, but also reinforced the general feeling of shabbiness that her drab, shapeless dress conveyed. There was some conversation. I recall now that she started talking as soon as she entered. "What a long hallway," she exclaimed. "You have a lot of books, just like my father." It was not the content of her communications, which continued in a steady stream of polite chatter for several minutes, but her voice that filled me with a sense of shock. It seemed to come from high up in her head, as though she were on stage in a performance where the director strove for the utmost sense of unreality. She seated herself at the little corner table in the playroom and lapsed into silence. "Do you know why you've come to see me?" I asked after a few moments. "There's one thing I know. You're nice," she replied, still not looking at me. Later, she picked up a crayon, and her nose, almost touching the paper, drew what looked like a blur. "That looks very interesting," I said, "but I'm not quite sure I know what it is." "It's an angel," she paused. "She can turn bad people into good." During her next session, Patty chalked her face in her arms. I'm Clang, the clown, she asserted, and after a moment added matter-of-factly, "There's a lion outside on the terrace." "A lion?" I exclaimed, just an edge of alarm in my voice. "You don't have to be scared," she assured me. "I'm also an animal trainer." When we entered the roof terrace, however, we found not only a lion, but a hairy elephant, a fire-breathing dragon, a poisonous alligator, and a host of other deadly creatures. "You live in a very dangerous world," I observed. "I am brave," she stated very simply. "I have courage." Except for a brief reference to her mother's unprovoked and inexplicable anger, and Patty's equally mystifying friendlessness, this was the world we dwelled in for many weeks. Patty arranged two loungers side by side, and we reclined in them, while the terrace vibrated to the thread of her monstrous beings. She felt right at home with them and tried to put me at my ease, always treating me like an honored guest who must never suffer a moment's discomfort. "Don't worry," she assured me. "I know how to control them." Happy the dragon spoke in sheets of flame and was the favorite. He was harnessed to provide chariot service for us. We mounted him and rode over the world. One day, far below us, Patty noted the circus tent and signaled "Happy" to descend. We hovered over it, watching the performers. Through a flap, they appeared to make a strong impression on Patty. "I'm a bareback rider," she announced. "Happy, we're coming in for a landing." We joined the circus. Since I was left to my own devices while Patty rode, I decided to assume the role of audience. As my enthusiastic applause rang out, Patty took her bows like an old trooper. She quickly added other acts to her routine. "I'm a trapeze artist," she stated, and then, "I'm a wonder dog, and finally, I'm a dancer." As, as one round of applause followed another, the monsters vanished into thin air, never more to haunt my terrace or to inhabit Patty's world. The circus was installed, and since I continued to be left without direction, as the acts multiplied, I decided there was room for a barker. Hear ye, I cried. "See the world's greatest bareback rider, the one and only undefeated champion. Or come one, come all, don't miss the chance of a lifetime. The great ballet dancer performs tonight. Hurry, hurry, hurry." Patty accepted these interventions with undisguised pleasure and acknowledged them with deep bows. After several weeks, Patty began to talk about a horse that lived in her garage. "He takes me to school every day," she informed me. "Sometimes he wears my clothes and sits next to me and gives me all the answers." She named the horse Tiger. "Tiger brought me today," she sometimes announced as she entered. "Or Tiger's waiting outside for us." Tiger galloped over the terrace with an abandon that evoked only admiration. "Bravo," I cried. "Bravo. What a beautiful horse. What a gorgeous mane. What galloping. I don't think I've ever seen a more graceful creature." From time to time, Tiger also escorted us to the circus and blended in with the performers. One day, Patty arrived at her session looking especially downcast. "Tiger and I ran away from my mother," she confided. "We found a water hole in the desert, and we're going to stay there for the rest of our lives and live on camel's meat." Away they went over the terrace. When they returned, Tiger galloped straight into my arms. Looking directly into my eyes for the first time, Patty stated, "You're the first master that's been good to me. I had two others, but they were both mean. One gave me water but no food. The other gave me food but no water. They locked me up in the garage twice and planned to blow me up, but I fooled them. I escaped. That's when you found me. I'm very glad. You're the first master that treats me right and gives me the right food and the right bed. A human bed." Soon after this, summer and vacation intervened. When Patty returned, Tiger alternated for a while with Wonder Dog, whom I was directed to train. During the previous period, the theme of a dog had come up intermittently. In addition to Wonder Dog, there had been the Fairy Dog, whom Patty had brought with her occasionally. One time he had assumed the shape of her umbrella and had provided some comfort against her father's anger on their way to her session. At another, he was just a tiny ball that answered to the name of Tinkerbell. Early in her treatment, she had also told me about the sad loss of her real dog, whom her mother had given away because he was bad. Now I was instructed to put Wonder Dog through increasingly difficult paces. He was made to jump over an imaginary rope that was continually raised higher and higher until it was obvious that only a wonder dog could meet such a challenge. Patty directed me to be harsh with him, to be constantly displeased with his efforts, to be threatening. Occasionally, I had to crack a whip. Hop to it now, I warned. We're not tolerating any sloppy performances around here. Wonder Dog cringed. I had definitely developed a streak of meanness, and Wonder Dog an attitude of martyrdom. By the time the cold drove us indoors to the playroom, Patty announced that she was a dog that didn't deserve to be a child, and that I was her owner. The dog that didn't deserve to be a child was called by a number of feminine names before she finally became Priscilla. She was as bad as a dog could be. She disobeyed, pretended to bite and claw, to tear and smash the furniture, to run away. In this role, Patty used words only to give me directions. Otherwise, she remained in character and barked all her communications. She also used no props. You have to punish me, she directed. You have to tell me how bad I am. The routine usually started with my going shopping, leaving Priscilla home alone. When I returned, I found such disorder that I could only stand in the doorway stunned. When I caught my breath, I gave vent to dismay, disappointment, and rage. Why I thought I could trust you, I exploded, and just look what you've done to this house. You've wrecked it. It seems as though I can't turn my back for a moment. You're just a bad dog and you're going to be punished. You have to beat me, Patty directed. There, I cried, pretending to wield the strap. That will teach you. Harder, Patty interposed. Harder. You worthless dog, I shouted, lashing out about me. That'll teach you to disobey me. Maybe next time you'll think twice before you tear up my couch. This seems like insanity, honestly. I mean, is this what child psychiatrists do? Now you must lock me in a cage and starve me. It just seems insane to indulge the fantasy of, I mean, I can understand discussing it, but to like play act, hey, I'm going to beat this dog. There, that'll show you, you worthless creature. Into the cage with you and not a scrap to eat. And Patty crouched in a corner, pretending viciousness and occasionally snapping at the bars. There were many variations of this scene, all in a rising crescendo of provocation and punishment, and there were many, many repetitions of variations. You have to beat me until I bleed, Patty directed one day, and then, now you have to call the doctor. The doctor was called, and I arrived in my new role. Well, who's sick around here? I inquired with professional joviality. Then, as I took in the details of the sordid scene, I could scarcely repress my feelings of shock. Well, what's happened here? I inquired. This looks pretty bad, I said, observing Priscilla's wounds. I know, it hurts, I added as I tenderly lifted first one limb and then the other. But don't worry, this will take care of it. I'll have you fixed up in no time. I pretended to bind carefully the suffering Priscilla's wounds, and then, as I was leaving, admonished the imaginary owner. This dog needs plenty of rest and good food. With the advent of the doctor, the fantasy assumed a new direction. There was no doubt that the doctor had reacted to what he considered an act of barbarous cruelty. The good but necessary punitive owner had actually already undergone a transformation by this time that required only the kind doctor's tender ministrations to define. Almost imperceptibly, Priscilla had also evolved from a bad to a good dog that was abused by a wicked owner who neither understood nor appreciated her. I was now directed to engage in unprovoked cruelty. Nothing that Priscilla did could please me. The mere sight of her was enough to stir me to rage. You beast, I shouted, you miserable beast, always doing everything wrong. Get out of my sight. Then a new element was introduced. There are two owners, Patty announced one day. There's a bad one and a good one. The bad one gets disgusted and sells Priscilla to the good one. And so the doctor underwent a metamorphosis. Now the session started with Priscilla's misbehavior and the bad owner's abuse and punishment. Then the sale took place, and Priscilla entered her new home, where every effort to please found a reward. And I'm going to stop there because I'm going to work today, so I must read something else before this. Goodbye, bruv. Goodbye.